Well, let's jump in and talk about validity. So, again, validity is the degree to which available evidence supports inferences made from scores and selection measures. So, I just want to take that apart a little bit. So, when we're looking at this definition of validity, we're basically looking at the evidence. So that's the first part that I really want to focus on. That validity is based on evidence, and there's different ways to gather that evidence. And what we're wanting to do is that evidence is used to support the inferences made from the scores to the selection measure. And that's a little different than we talk about validity from a statistical viewpoint or more from a theoretical viewpoint. So the inference we're interested in are the scores that we're measuring highly related to what we're expecting to predict in the future. So in other words, if we've identified a core skill that is necessary for the job, it's highly related to performance, and we've created a measure that measures that trait, that knowledge, skill, or ability, is the inference that your performance on that selection measure going to actually infer performance on the job. So validation is the research process of discovering what and how well a selection procedure measures. So what does it measure, how well does it measure, and does it actually predict what it's supposed to predict? Now, generally speaking, if we're talking validity from a more theoretical or academic viewpoint, we're also more interested in, is it actually measuring what we think it's measuring? Is it validly capturing a construct? I would say that is, again, probably a little less important at this point. It's more of, does it actually measure what we're wanting to measure, or at least measure something that is highly related to our criterion, our outcome, performance? So just briefly, the relationship between reliability and valid. You can be highly reliable without valid. That's very possible. You can have a very reliable test that is absolutely just not related to performance. However, it's very hard to have high validity without reliability. So that's why we often look at reliability first. We want to find out if it's reliable, because if it isn't, we can't continue on to ask about validity. Now, that again is assuming that we're measuring a stable trait, a stable construct that is reliably predictable of performance. Making that assumption, we need high reliability before we even talk about validity. So a validation study provides that evidence for determining the accuracy of judgments made from scores on a predictor about important job behaviors as represented by a criterion. So again, highly technical language for the most part, but we're getting at the fact that we're trying to predict performance or predict some other organizational relevant outcome. Usually performance, but it may also be job engagement, it may also be motivation, it may also be a component of kind of organizational fit or again, just various factors depending on what the job entails, but we're still trying to predict some criterion, some organizational relevant outcome. And can this selection measure actually predict the behaviors that would be represented by that criterion? Now, the types of validation strategies, what we can do in a validation study, include content validity, or content validation, criterion related validity, or criterion related validation, and there's two forms of that, concurrent and predictive, and construct validation. So we're going to talk about each in turn, and you can have a validation study that uses all three. You can have a validation study that only relies on one, and you can have a validation study that relies on multiple techniques. Now, ideally, we probably want to look at all of them, but within the industrial organizational psychology, we're mainly focused on results. We're mainly focused on, does this actually predict an outcome in the organization, generally performance. Therefore, criterion related validation is where we're mainly going to focus, and most validation strategies or studies in IO psychology tend to focus more on criterion related validity. I would say what we often find is content validation may occur early in the process of creating a scale or a new measure. We're usually going to use criterion related validity as our final step. And it's fairly rare to find a validation study in a practical or practice setting that really gets touching on construct validation, though it is still an important part, especially if we're wanting to generalize a selection measure to other organizations. Did we really actually capture a construct that is kind of universal and stable that we could find in other samples and other populations and in other workplaces? So let's start with content validation. Content validation is basically pretty much what it sounds like. We're looking at the content. We're looking at the actual items. We're basically using either subject matter experts or, in a pinch, maybe our own expertise to just make sure that the items that we're measuring, the questions that we're using, objectively look like they represent the actual job behaviors of the KSAOs that we're measuring. So it's the content of the selection measure. Is it representative of a sample of the content of the job or the component of the job that we're trying to capture with that measure? So if we have 10 items that are meant to capture motivation, do they all look like they actually capture motivation? And do they seem representational of the overall construct? Are they asking enough questions about motivation that we can reliably expect that people that respond on that, that's what we're capturing? Motivation, which we then infer is related to performance. So why content validation? We're going to use content validation a lot of times when it's really the only tool we have available. So a small number of applicants for a position, we don't have enough people coming through to actually use a statistical technique such as criterion-related validity. It focuses on job content, not job success. And what that really basically means is sometimes we may be actually just measuring elements about whether someone would be a good fit for the job that is not directly tied to a success criterion. In other words, we may not have a measure to actually capture what we're trying to measure in a selection technique, but we still think it's an important thing to know in making a job decision. A lot of times those O behaviors may fall into this category where we're really trying to capture something that we think is key to working well in the organization. In our own selection procedures within the Industrial Organizational Psychology program here at SIUE, I would say an example of that is as we build a cohort through selection offers, we're often trying to create a group of people that are likely to get along well. And that may look different with each year and each cohort. Because as we make our initial decisions, those people coming in start to become the base that we build on to try to create a group that we hope will work well together. That isn't necessarily tied to a direct success criteria. So the content items, the items that we try to use to gather that information in our structured interviews, really all we have is content validity. We can't really look to see are they working or not because it's a very complex idea that doesn't have an easy objective criterion to measure it against. We can also use content validity simply for the perceptions of fairness. I've often said, as many people will, that perception is reality. It doesn't matter what's actually happening a lot of the times. It matters how people are perceiving something. So whether or not something's fair, whether or not something has been shown statistically to be a strong predictor, if it's perceived as unfair, if it's perceived as unrelated to the job, it basically has what we call as low face validity. In other words, people react poorly to the item because they can't see how it's related to whether or not they would do well at the job. So sometimes we'll use content validation because selection is a two-way street. We're also trying to bring people into an organization. We're not only trying to find people that we want to hire, we want to make sure that once we make the offer, they want to come and take the job. So we do have to worry a little bit about the perceptions of our selection tools. Because what can happen is that if we have a selection tool that has strong criterion-related validity, it does predict job performance, but has a low perception of fairness. People don't see how it's related and people react poorly to it. Even someone that does well on our job selection may still think poorly of the selection process. Also, we can be using it to just basically look at the job content domain. So that's really what we're looking at, the behaviors in KSAs, what is the content of the measure, and what must be representational of the job content domain. What this really refers to is that a lot of times we're going to use content validity to create a large number of items. We're going to create a job content domain of items, including behaviors, knowledge, skills, and abilities that all seem to be logically related to whatever we're trying to measure. And from that pool of items, we may then try to reduce down to a number that we can actually use in our actual measures. So what's the major aspects of a content validation? We conduct a comprehensive job analysis. So like almost everything, we start with a job analysis. We want a description of the task that we're trying to capture. We want to know how important those tasks are. We need a specification of the KSAs required to perform those tasks. We need to measure the importance of those KSAs, and then we need to link those important job tasks to those important KSAs. So again, the first process of doing a content validation is what are we actually trying to measure, what tasks is it supposed to predict, and what KSAs are required for those tasks. That gives us a framework to build that job content domain. that series of questions that will be representational of what we're trying to capture. We generally want to select experts, subject matter experts. We want to create a pool for the pool of experts to then go through the list, or maybe even be involved in creating the list based on the structure we've developed from the job analysis. So the job analysis is we're basically creating the roadmap. We then select experts that are going to use that roadmap to actually generate the items. Specification of the selection measure content, so the selection procedure as a whole, an item by item analysis, supplementary indications of content validity. We're going to put all of that together, and that's the process of actually deciding how will this be used, how are we going to generate items with our subject matter experts. Once we have the items, how are we going to rate those items on how important they are to the actual original roadmap from the job analysis, how representational are they, how important are they? So we might have some items that are relatively important but just capture one element of the KSAs. We may have a key skill that we need to capture that we have multiple items for. And we're also going to look at supplemental indications of content analysis beyond the subject matter experts. We may look at additional measures, other measures that measure similar things, what's being done in other organizations, and benchmarking. And finally, once we have the completed measure, we're going to do an assessment of selection measures and job content relevance. So we're going to pilot test it as well. So this is just an example of the depiction of inferences points from an analysis of a job content to selection measure content and content validation. So again, content validation is fairly subjective. It is involving people's opinions. It's rarely numerical. Once we have actual items, people may rate how likely they think that they're actually capturing the content. But just recognize again that we have, again, a fair amount of inferential leaps. We have the job analysis, which we're using to represent the job, but that's an inference in itself, that the job is properly captured by that job analysis. That job analysis then fuels the specification of job tasks. Our inference leap then is the identification of KSAs that are required to perform those tasks. From there, we have an inferential leap to the development and selection of the measure form. So in other words, what we're actually measuring. We're also looking at the physical fidelity and the psychological fidelity, the content validity between the job analysis that tells us that these are the KSAs and the actual measure that we designed to capture those KSAs. And when we actually have the final measure, we infer back through the job analysis one last time, do these measures actually capture job relevant skills, tasks, knowledge, skills, and ability? So let's quickly go through the uniform guidelines and content validity. So the uniform guidelines do touch on content validity, and basically they say content validation is not appropriate when it's mental processes, psychological constructs, or personality traits that are not directly observable but are inferred from a selection device. So content validation alone is not a good tool if we're actually trying to get at complex hidden constructs such as cognitive ability or personality. If the selection procedure involves KSAs, an employee is expected to learn on the job. So again, we shouldn't be using content validity to come up with questions that are supposed to be measuring something that someone shouldn't know yet. And the content of the selection device does not resemble a work behavior when the setting and administration of the selection procedure does not resemble the work setting. So again, if we have an abstract measure, all three of these are somewhat, well, actually 1 in 3 are really looking at the same thing. If it's something that isn't easily defined, we shouldn't be using just content validity to capture. And finally, we need to make sure that we're not using content validity to capture something that we probably shouldn't be capturing in selection in the first place. Basic considerations for determining the feasibility of a content and criterion-related validity strategies. So content validation must be able to obtain a complete documented analysis of each job. So we have to start with the job analysis. Without a job analysis, we're basically just swinging in the dark. It is applicable when selection devices purports to measure existing job skills, existing knowledge, and existing behavior. Inferences is that the content of the selection device measures the content of the job at the start point. So skills, knowledge, and behaviors you need to have prior to taking the job, not something you would learn once you have it. Although not necessarily required, it should be able to show that criterion-related methodology is not feasible. So again, if all you're using is content validity, you probably want to have at least some information about why you could not use other methods. The inferential leap from content to the selection device to the job content should be a small one. So this is kind of getting a little bit more at face validity. So the more you can make a logical argument that what you're measuring is related to what is required by the job analysis and is related to the actual performance, the smaller those inferential leaps, the more safe you are using just content validity. Most likely to be viewed as suitable when skills and knowledge for the job are being measured. So again, it usually is better for measuring skills, do you know how to do it, or knowledge, you know about it. Abilities usually starts to get into those psychological constructs and is not a good area for us to be using only content validity. Content validity might be a great place to start in generating items, but we need to go beyond that if we really are trying to make these more large inferences. And when you think about it, this also makes a certain amount of sense. It's a larger inference to say that your ability, cognitive ability, is directly related to skills and tasks of the job that are directly related to performance. Those are some pretty big inferences to make. It's a lot easier to say, if you know how to operate this particular machine, and this is the particular machine that you're going to use in the job, that is something that might be just content. We can come with 3 or 4 items that ask you about your knowledge or your skills with that particular machine. Again, it's not suitable when abstract mental processes, constructs, or traits are being measured or inferred, and a part of that again comes to that fact that we're making bigger inferential leaps. May not provide sufficient validation information when applicants are ranked. So if the only measures you have were created with content validity and you're using them solely for selection, the decision making, that may not be the best place to be if you end up in a court of law being challenged on the decisions you made. And a substantial amount of critical job behaviors in KSA should be represented in the selection measure. So again, we want to make sure that if we are using content validation techniques, we also have a fair amount of those knowledge, skills, and abilities that are being measured by those techniques. So content validity versus criterion related validity. Content validity focuses on the selection of the measures itself. It is based on a broader base of data and inference. So basically, we don't have as much easily objective measures, and we're making bigger inferences. The inferences should be smaller, but we have less success in making those inferences. We have less data to make those inferences on. And is generally characterized by using a broader, more judgmental descriptors or descriptions. Criterion-related validity focuses on an external variable. It focuses on an actual criterion, is narrowly based on a specific set of data, and is couched in terms of precise quantitative indices, prediction. So with criterion-related validity, we have mathematical prediction of our selection tool on our criterion outcome performance organizational relevant measure. With content validity, all we really have is a descriptor of our measure, a descriptor of the job, and the assumption that those two descriptions, if a strong enough match, would infer to performance. So criterion-related strategies, let's go to them. So there's 2 basically types: concurrent validation. Both predictor and criterion data is obtained on a current group of employees. Basically, this is the present method, employee method. So instead of actually using a new selection measure amongst applicants, which is a longer process, we basically just take people that we already have, are already in the job, where we already have criterion information on them. We have work appraisals, we have some form of performance, that criterion. And then we give them the predictor, and we simply compare the two and look for the correlations. How strongly did the predictor actually predict top performers from lower performers? So the major steps undertaken in conducting a concurrent validity study versus a predictive validation study. So with concurrent validity, we conduct a job analysis, always start with there. Once again, we're determining the relevant KSAs and other characteristics required to perform the job successfully, so we're identifying what should we be measuring. We choose to develop an experimental predictor of these KSAs. We select the criteria for job success, so what are we wanting to compare our selection tool to on the job success? Performance, attendance, motivation. Then we administer the predictors to current employees at the same time that we collect the criterion data, and we analyze the predictor and the criterion data relationships. With a predictive validity study, it's fairly similar up to a point. We're still doing a job analysis, we're still looking for the relevant KSAs, we're still choosing or developing an experimental predictor of these KSAs, we're still selecting a criterion for job success. However, we now administer the predictors to job applicants and hold on to the results. Then, the applicants that are hired, once we have the criterion data after a passage of suitable period, we then analyze the predictor and criterion data relationships. So just very quickly, concurrent validity, the advantage here is it's quicker and it's cheaper, and we're using existing employees, which means we also have a larger available pool to gather our data with. The downside is we're not looking at applicants, and they're likely not that motivated to really do their best on the selection measure. Predictive validation has the advantages of we're actually looking at applicants. They're probably more motivated. The downside is that it may take us longer to get a large enough sample to do the analysis, and no matter what, we have to wait, and we only are looking at the people that we actually selected into the workplace. So we're not gathering data on people that did not get hired. So there's different predictive validity designs, follow-up random selection, follow-up present systems, selection by predictor, hire and then test, personnel file research. I'm not going to read through all of these. This is a slide that you really should just take a good look at, pause it for a few minutes, take a look, read through them, and just recognize that there are different techniques that all play around with this similar idea. And each one has their advantages and disadvantages. And advantages are usually the longer it takes, the more it costs, the better the data. So that's kind of just a broad truth in any predictive validity design, is that we have this kind of seesaw effect that if we really want good data, it's going to take more time and it's going to take more money. And a lot of times we have to kind of decide what system we're using on how much time and how much money we have available. So the requirements of a criterion-related validity study: the job should be reasonably stable and not in a period of change and transition. A relevant, reliable criterion that is free from contamination must be available or feasible to develop. So we have to have a measure of performance that we trust, that is reliable and valid to begin with. Now, this might seem like a basic idea, but this is probably where a lot of validation studies die, on this point right here. Before actually doing a criterion-related validity study, it is almost paramount that you really look at what is the criteria you're being asked to compare it to, and does it truly differentiate between top, middle, and bottom performers. I can tell you for a fact that I have been involved in multiple criterion-related validity studies for major companies that when I asked them, how are you measuring performance, their answer was pretty piss poor, honestly. And I had to tell them that what they needed to do was work on their performance measures before they ever paid me to do a criterion-related validity study, and whatever I found with the study would be highly suspect because they didn't have a reliable measure of performance for me to even look at. I rarely was listened to, and they paid me to run the analyses, and I said yes, thank you, and took the check. So 3, it must be possible to base the validation study on a sample of people and jobs that is representational of the people and jobs to which the result will be generalized. This is basically a fancy way to say you got to have enough people applying to the same job. So a lot of times organizations will be like, well, what if we look at the selection procedure across the entire company, because we use it for executives, we use it for middle management, we use it for sales, we use it for customer support. Those are all very different jobs, and again, a validation study looking at all of those is probably not going to give you good data. You want to be able to look at a base of similar people applying to similar jobs, and that base needs to be large enough to give you the data you need. And again, that means a large enough and representational sample of people whom both the predictor, the selection tool, and criterion, performance, have been collected must be available. So the basic considerations for determining the feasibility of a content and criterion-related validity study. So criterion-related validation. Must be able to assume the job is reasonably stable. Must be able to obtain a relevant, reliable, and uncontaminated measure of job performance. Should be based as much as possible on a sample that is representational of the people and the jobs which the results are to be generalized. Should have an adequate statistical power in order to identify a predictor-criterion relationship if one exists. To do so, we must have adequate sample size, and the variance or individual differences in scores on both the selection measure and the criterion must exist. So let's stop on this one for a minute. Adequate sample size. Correlations need large samples to find smaller effects. And in selection, we're often looking for relatively small effects. We're looking for kind of, beating Vegas odds. We're starting with you're just selecting people based on your guts. Let's see if we can come up with a better answer. And the better answer often does not explain all the variance. So as a general rule, the bare minimum that you should have in a correlation is approximately 10 people per variable. So if all you are looking at is one selection tool, one particular variable, on one particular outcome, that tells you need a minimum of 20 people. But if we actually look at statistical significance with correlation at 20 people, that actually requires us to find a fairly strong effect size for it to be significant, somewhere in the R of 0.4 range. So generally speaking, I think it's better to have at least 20 per variable, and also recognize that a lot of times when we're doing validation studies, we're actually trying to validate multiple predictors, and sometimes on multiple outcomes, multiple criteria. So recognize the sample size issue. And again, we need to make sure, do people truly vary on the selection tools? Are we seeing a normal distribution? Is it normally distributed? Is it skewed? Is it kurtotic? We're especially worried about leptokurtic distributions with very little variance here. And again, do we see variance on the actual criterion? If either of those do not have much variance, it's going to be very hard to find any relationship. 5. Must be able to obtain a complete analysis for each of the jobs for which the validation study is being conducted. We need to be used to justify the predictors and the criterion being studied. In other words, we need to have enough data to be able to make conclusions and inferences that these are working. So we must be able to infer that performance on the selection measure can predict future job performance, and we do that mathematically through the correlation. And again, we must have the ample resources in time, staff, and money to be able to conduct this. So construct validation strategies. A construct is a postulated concept, attribute, characteristic, or quality that can be assessed by a measure. So construct validation is the research process involved in collecting of evidence to test a hypothesis about relationships between measures and their constructs. This is getting at, is it actually measuring what we think it's measuring? Are we actually measuring the construct we claim we are? So if I'm measuring extroversion, am I actually getting an extroversion? So we're moving a little bit beyond the question, does whatever I'm measuring predict sales ability, to is it actually measuring the psychological construct that I'm claiming it is? Methods of gathering construct validation include internal consistency, so item total correlations, factor analysis, internal consistency analysis. So again, we're looking at, do the items hang together well? Are they internally consistent? And that's step one. Because again, if we're measuring a construct and we believe it is a single concept, like extroversion, and that it's relatively stable, all of our items should be highly intercorrelated. We then start looking at known group validity. So if we know, for instance, that certain groups vary on that trait, so we have groups that we know are highly extroverted by their outward behaviors versus groups that are very low or introverted based on their behavior, we should be able to give the test to them if it's internally consistent and find that the introverts score low on a measure of extroversion and the extroverts score high. We also can talk about convergent and divergent validity. So basically we want to show that our measure is highly related to similar constructs and not related to dissimilar constructs. And one of the ways we can sometimes do this is called the multi-trait, multi-method matrix, which is a way to try to get at convergent and divergent validity in one large statistical study. So a hypothetical example of the construct validity of a link between working as a team member, construct, and team inventory indicators. So again, we have the indicator, the teamwork inventory, the actual measure. We want to see, is that related to supervisor ratings as far as performance as a team member? Is that then actually related to working as a team member, job performance? Is that related to the ability to work with others? And are all these constructs interrelated to the indicator, the measure that we're looking at? So we're not looking at a single inference now. We're trying to measure multiple inferences and have hypotheses about which inferences we should and should not find. And that kind of a study is moving more towards measuring the construct itself. So steps in a construct validation study. The construct must be carefully defined and hypotheses formed concerning the relationships between the construct and other variables. So honestly, the first step in a construct validity study is past research. It is a lit review. It's looking to see how well has this construct been defined in the past, how do people define it, what items are actually been found in the past to be highly correlated with it, and what should it be and not be related to. A measured hypothesis is then created to assess the construct as it's developed. So what should it be related to, what should it not be related to, and then finally we do a study testing the hypothesized relationships formed in step 1 between the construct measure and other relevant variables. And we will have both hypotheses that are positive and negative. We'll have hypotheses: this measure, if it is the construct we think it is, should be related to measure 2, 3, and 4, but it should not be related to measure 5, 6, and 7. So measuring a construct, the inner correlations amongst the measure's parts should show if the parts cluster into one or more groups. So that's the factor analysis or internal consistency. If we have a measure that is measuring a single psychological construct, we should have strong evidence that all of the items are measuring a similar thing. Part of the measure belonging to the same grouping should be internally consistent or reliable. So if we do find multiple clusters, do we predict multiple clusters? So the big 5 is an example of a hypothesized cluster of 5. So when we give a big 5 measure to people, if we're actually doing a construct validity on it, we're expecting it. Our hypothesis is that we'll find 5 clusters, and each of those clusters should be highly reliable and consistent. Different measures assessing a same or similar construct as the developed measure should be highly related with the new developed measure. And content validity studies should also show how experts have judged the manner in which parts of the measures were developed and how these parts of the measures sample the job content domain. In other words, this is a way to say that when we're doing a construct validation, we're usually not doing it in isolation. It is the final step after having already gone through the process of content and criterion validity or validation. Let's briefly talk about interpreting the validity coefficients. What precisely does a statistically significant coefficient mean? So the coefficient of determination is the percentage of variance in the criteria that can be explained. So generally speaking, we're talking about R squared. We're talking about effect size. So we really want to get an idea for the size of the effect that we're actually looking at. We want to know how much better prediction do we get with this selection technique than if we were not using this selection technique. And a lot of the times we can look up expectancy tables and charts that are going to allow us to do a utility analysis, an economic interpretation of the meaning of the validity coefficient. So basically what I'm saying here is that when we're just talking academics, we always want to see a large effect size. If we're talking practice, we want to find out what is that effect size, how much bigger was that effect size than the previous measures we used, and based on how much better we're predicting, how much money will that save the company? So prediction can be either linear regression or regression equations. So we're usually the statistic we're most often using for any type of validity, whether it's criterion related validity or content validity, is a series of regressions. So we're determining the nature of the change in the criterion scores are functionally related to change in the predictor scores. We're looking for how do the predictor scores interrelate in predicting the criterion. And we're going to create then a regression equation mathematically describing the functional relationship. So multiple regression is usually what we're using here because we often have more than one predictor, and we're basically trying to create the regression equation, the prediction equation. What do we predict someone's performance based on their performance on multiple selectors once we hire them?